Wait.
No, it was 9.
Oh,
Hello and welcome to the Anavultus show. And today I am Anavultus here with a wide array of guests. I've got Robert from the Generational Gap, John from the Generational Gap, Wyatt from Roundtable Decision, and J. Edgar from Ed's World. And today we're here to discuss The Monopoly on Violence, a documentary that got put out from an anarchist perspective. It talks about the history of anarchism, some critiques on statism, and explores anarchism in a broader sense. So let's have some basic thoughts about the production. Now, I will start out, of course, saying that the visuals, in my view, were pretty good. The sound quality was good. I think the way they carried out the interviews was well performed, well cut together. So I think that overall, the actual filmmaking quality is on point, even if it's not a AAA budget or anything like that. But let's have some other viewpoints. Robert.
Um, well, I have to say that and this was mentioned, but I agree with it completely off mic. That there was a lot of propaganda to it, but I uh, I thought it was well made. It had a lot of logical thinking involved, but I wasn't I wasn't thrilled with the direction that most of the opinions were expressed were leading to. I couldn't agree with much of what I was hearing.
Okay. John?
Yeah, I was actually going to say, if I can just piggyback off of what Robert was saying, there is definitely truth to it's hard to follow if you're not already kind of immersed into libertarianism, because it does introduce topics that they expect you to know things that you might not know in order to understand where they're going further. It's definitely not my first libertarian, you know. It's not, it's not that. It's a little bit more advanced than that. So, yeah, for someone who's not well versed in it, they're probably not going to follow it.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
Wyatt, what are your thoughts? Just some basic preliminary thoughts before we get into any deep topic.
yeah, I thought I would. I had to watch the documentary twice. The first time I watched it all the way through, without any stops, and I made a time to block out anything and just watch it fully. And then the second time was more like in spurts, here and there when I had time to do so. And in general, I would say, like you mentioned earlier, I thought the interviews and things were done very well, and what the people were well spoken in their thoughts. But at the same time, I didn't necessarily agree with every step they took to get to their final process of what we'll get into in a little bit later, but their final idea of the whole documentary. So I like the concept and how it was done, but not necessarily what everything in it was said. If that, yeah.
Okay. And J. Edgar?
Well, I did try to dig into this much while I was going in, while I was working, and like everyone else had said, I mean, this is not baby's first libertarianism documentary. That is for sure. And if you are going to get into it, if you're going to tear into it, you definitely want to take some time and actually sit down and block yourself out from everything. With everything else that's going on around me up throughout the day, it was a little bit hard to follow.
Yeah, I think I'd have to agree with that to some point. Now, of course, I personally am someone who does research a lot of different political viewpoints. So, from my perspective, it wasn't particularly hard to follow. But I will say that on a number of issues, they didn't really go in depth. And I can understand why they didn't, because it's already 105 minutes long. So,
Mhm.
might not have been convenient to do that. But it sure would be interesting to see perhaps the extended interviews that they had
Mm-hmm.
with the individuals that they interviewed. But on that idea that it's kind of hard to follow, what do you think is the documentary about? What is it about,
Uh,
Robert? first.
Oh, I would definitely, I definitely took away a strong appeal for libertarianism. That, I mean, and trying to expose how, basically our government does have, as the title suggests, a monopoly on violence. Um, Thus, but a lot of that is because of the liberties that we've allowed ourselves to give up and liberties that we need to take back from the government. That's what I took away from it. That's what I think they were trying to get across, that libertarianism is the actual way to release the stranglehold on violence that our government has.
Well, I'd like to point out here for the record that, in my view, it wasn't so much as libertarianism as it was discussing a wide variety of anarchist views, some of which are very opposed to libertarianism. Um,
I can agree with that. From that standpoint of exposing, other avenues. They did talk about anarchy a lot. How anarchism, is at the root of a lot of this. But I really did get a feeling that most of the people that were talking were speaking from a libertarian standpoint. That was just the overall vibe I got from most of the people speaking.
yeah. John?
Yeah, it definitely seemed like it was anarcho-capitalist propaganda specifically, and the old standard, nana nana boo boo, we're the real libertarians. Like that's kind of, that's kind of what it seemed like to me. Um, which I mean, they definitely made some good points, but it still left me with all the same questions I have about anarchy in general. When they brought up police and how privatized police would be better, and they went the laissez-faire, free market, capitalist route of competing companies, and you would see the best ones would be eventually the ones that are set up as police. But there was no answer to how to hold them accountable, the court system and what that would look like, if there would be one. It left a lot more questions and answers, which maybe was the intention behind it. But it certainly seemed like it was just kind of, like I said, anarcho-capitalist propaganda, which I'm
Okay.
not necessarily against. But yeah,
Yeah. And I've been looking at the comments a bit, and I'd just like to say for the record that none of us, as far as I'm aware of, got kicked off of Discord. We're just
yeah,
doing
we
it on
didn't.
Zoom because John recommended it, that it was more stable than using
Yeah,
Discord.
I think he's talking about our server, but no, it's still there.
Yeah.
I think maybe he's talking individually. If you're talking about Michael Vega, it
Yeah.
sounds like he got knocked out,
Yeah,
Okay.
much like I believe Midget did.
Yeah.
right. I was gonna say it's probably the same situation
Yeah.
because his name's still there. But yeah,
So Wyatt, what do you think the documentary is about?
I would say, from a very general viewpoint, the documentary is very much like "Don't trust the government," and obviously, you don't have to watch that to know fully, like watch the whole thing to know fully that that's what it was about. But from a more detailed perspective, I would say the documentary was mainly about not trusting the government in this type of way, and that type of way was more through anarchism, and basically not necessarily like, okay, don't have distrust, but rather show that you don't have distrust. I do think that it was trying to push more uh, agenda of doing something rather than just kind of being a bystander to the situation.
Okay. J. Edgar?
Well, I had a hard time saying documentary to this, and that's I was looking into this, hoping to maybe see a little bit more documented proof, but it's like John said, this seemed a little bit more like a sales pitch to try and go with the stateless kind of system. I'm not sure if that makes any sense or not, but
Yeah, I
yeah,
understand exactly. So I'll give you my perspective on it, and I think the reason why Robert mentioned the word, I believe the word was propaganda, was because I had mentioned it in our talk beforehand. Um, because from the way I saw it, it's not about anarchism in general as an exploration of anarchism as you would expect a documentary to be, nor is it about the monopoly of violence as a specific topic. To me, it seems to be more about getting a thought process leading into anarchism, a train of thought leading into anarchism, making some very specific complaints against statism while giving a broad option for anarchism, and at the same time having a very one-sided approach to it, so that one side looks good, the other side looks bad, without really having any dialogue in between. And at the end of it, you may have noticed towards the end, there's a portion where they talk about various anarchist charities, and then there's a portion where they talk about how you can get involved. So it definitely has that propaganda feel to it, certainly, or at least that's what it accomplishes in my mind. Any reactions to that?
No, I mean that seems pretty spot on.
No, yeah,
I
definitely.
don't have any objections.
No, I could see that point.
Yeah. So, on a topic that we mentioned briefly, but that Wyatt wanted to talk about a bit more, alternatives to policing. Robert, give us what you thought on their views on that, or perhaps your own views on that as well.
I've been coming to a realization that I've talked about on our show. I've talked about with John and multiple people, and it's really coming down to an inevitability that no matter what you do, no matter what system you have in place, whether it is anarchism or uh, uh, libertarianism, whether it's what we have now, you're going to have somebody policing things, because you can't expect the community to do everything that's necessary when the size of some of the communities that would have to be banded together to do this are too large. I mean, I could see some of this working, some of the alternative policing methods working on a small scale, but we have too many options in this country for large scale that I just don't think these options work. You have to have some sort of solid police force, which opens the door to that monopoly on violence. And so almost any system is going to have to set up some sort of state in some way, shape, or form to handle that kind of thing. That's just my opinion. I think population densities, the size of our country, it's just too much to do on a community level, like some of the alternatives that they talked about would do.
Well, I think their position on that would be that the size of a country isn't really in play, because in an anarchy, they don't really have that. You know what I'm saying? That there's no national cohesion.
But that runs contrary to what people want to do, and people want to live. They will cluster. There are some that won't, and they like living away from other people. But on the whole, most of us like to clump together for efficiency, etc. And when you do that, you really have to take into account the amount of people that you're trying to govern or police or control. It comes down to control.
Well, actually, I want to take that just a little bit of a step further, if I could, for a second on this here. It's something I've mentioned on my show before, and I've heard a couple other different pundits say kind of the same thing. I mean, you can go ahead and disband and defund the police all that you want, and that does seem to be not from the anarchic sense, but I'm sure the anarchists are sitting right now looking at our current political situation and saying, okay, yeah, left, okay, yeah, let's go ahead and do this. With that being said, though, if you disband the police departments, all the police departments, and just throw them all away, first off, the very rich people are going to go ahead and get private security. And the suburban soccer moms with their leased BMW are all going to cluster together and say, okay, well, we want a security firm. We want to either pay somebody to come in, have security for our neighborhood, or we just want to have ourselves a little neighborhood watch, which we fund it. Either way, they're going to pull their money together and to do something like this, and money's going to get involved in this. And then the left is going to look at this and say, hey, why are the rich people getting this? We need to have state-run control of this. Let's make this a human right and a natural resource here, and we're back. We're back to police.
Mhm.
Okay. John?
Yeah, I mean, again, their privatized police thing. I mean, well, I would. It's a nice idea. I would like to be able to do something like that, but there's no way to create objectivity when there's a group of people giving money to another group of people. Uh, I mean, the government is more objective, I would say, than your neighborhood or your town or something like that. Pulling their money together in a private way. Um, I don't see how it wouldn't be even worse, like even more corrupt, even more. Because I mean, at that point, you don't really need. I don't know. It just seems like it would be really easily corruptible
So
and
you're saying that
used as a political tool, even more so at a more local level. Because all the politics would be at a more local level. It's just not a good idea. I don't think it'll
so
work.
you're saying that at least the government has a not necessarily an incentive, but a motive to attempt to be neutral,
Right.
which
At
someone
least
who's privately paid might not have.
exactly. Yeah. Exactly.
Okay, Wyatt?
And okay, go ahead. Sorry.
No,
Yeah,
it's
I would
okay.
say when I heard that part of the documentary, if and as Ed was saying, it is something that I myself thought about a little bit too, with hesitating to really call it a documentary more than pushing an agenda or propaganda. But that's kind of besides the point of this topic. But I remember it mentioned that police have a monopoly on violence, and their action of being a police is by itself violent and organization to keep people under control through using the force of violence. And they talked about a little more. And what I got away from that talk point was essentially they wanted to replace the police. And I was looking to figure out kind of what they wanted to replace it with, but their answer didn't really give me something that I felt satisfied with. I don't think they really answered the question of what would replace the police. And I think with what we're seeing now and what we've seen in the past, I don't think that the police are something that can be replaced. So unless if I hear something that is at least intelligent with what might replace the police, it's still going to have the police. So, in other words, whatever you're going to replace the police with is still going to have some sort of way to control people. And the best way to control people is the use of weapons or and other things like it. So it's
Mhm.
like even if you replace the police with your own militia or own force, you're still going to kind of have the same weapons or same ideas the police have.
Yeah. Well,
Well,
I'd
and
like to say that on the example that they gave, I believe it was that one community in Mexico that I looked it up, and they're run as a direct democracy. So presumably their police force is a sort of a posse that they get together, or a sort of you could call it a voluntary militia that they get together. And that, as Robert says, that can work on a small scale, but if you're trying to hold a larger system together, obviously, then you run into problems where you need to actually have that coordinate on higher levels, and then you need more organization. And especially if you are attempting to enforce specific laws, in order to enforce those specific laws in an even handed manner, you would want to expand that idea as well. So, John, you were also going to say something as well?
No, no, no. I mean, the moment's passed now. Yeah,
well,
Okay.
I want to actually point something out here and just kind
yeah.
of because we're talking about structuring the police and what we could replace them with. You do have to keep in mind that the current structure of the police departments that we have is based on an outdated system of laws that we've had, or not an outdated system of laws, but an outdated system of government that we haven't really had since before World War One. We're talking back to Lincoln era at this point here when the police the idea of the police was first founded, we were still sitting on the fact that the government still only did defense and interstate commerce.
Mhm.
We were when the police were developed at that point, that was still on that. Now, it's always been my position. I'm a bad libertarian on this, but it's always been my position that if the government is going to create laws, it's their responsibility to enforce them. That's part of the reason that we have police. But once again, we go up from the federal level to the state level. When the police were formed, your laws were made either by your mayor and your city, or maybe in your county or your state, but the proper department was responding to this. Now we have police that are coming out here to enforce laws that are made from Washington D.C. and that are shoved down on the rest of us here. So I think the modern idea of policing could work if we got rid of so much top-down federal control of the country.
Well,
Okay. But again, I would say that from the perspective of the documentary makers, the way they would characterize that criticism would be as a binary option between having a corrupt police system and abolishing the police. While, of course, there are many individuals who would instead be in favor of police reform.
well, to be honest with you, what I'm of a mind that you're going to run into is, you know, when we look at some of the things that have prompted all of this discussion in this country, we need to bear in mind, I think, that these are small. This is just a small percentage of the amount of cases the police deal with and things that they do in a nonviolent way. This is just a small percentage. And it doesn't matter who you put the power in the hands of. If you tell someone that they have to protect citizenry and mete out justice and police law, there this is going to happen. I don't care what size the community is. I don't care what your alternative policing force is. It is going to be a repeat. These things will happen. The only difference is now it's visible. It gets blasted out to the rest of the world through social media. So 5 cases of police brutality gets turned into everything that the police do wrong.
Mhm.
And it would be exposed no matter what level of policing you're doing, no matter what alternative policing you try to do. It's going to be the same result, just like corruption in a government.
I would agree on that. Now, my own perspective on this issue is that of a bit more of an anthropological, sociological perspective, in that I view policing, especially organized policing, as being a consequence and a necessity in a more complex society, because as societies become more complex, there increases a uh, broader variety of burden of labor, as well as a broader variety of burden of intellect. And that's how, for example, in the medical field, now 100 years ago, there used to be a handful of types of doctors. Now there's a bunch of different doctor varieties and different jobs you can have in the medical field. So a similar thing occurs when you look at government. So it used to be that uh, the police may have been one person who then calls up a posse, but now the society has become complex to the point where it's actually more convenient and more efficient to have people that are specifically trained to do this. And that also helps us enforce our laws in a more consistent fashion. And it actually makes, in my view, these accidents that do happen less likely to happen. But as Robert says, they still will probably end up being brought out of proportion. So that's my viewpoint. What do you think? Uh,
Yeah, I mean, I got nothing to add. So yeah, I mean, that's pretty
I mean, it
concise.
makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, when it's all said and done, that is why I have started just making peace with the inevitable. A state is inevitable. It's necessary, and no matter how small you want to say your community is, and the community polices itself and governs itself, guess what? It's just going to be a small form of the state, because you're going to have to sacrifice certain liberties, you're going to have to sacrifice certain things, and you're going to have to abide by certain laws. And this idea that, I mean, it just leaves an open door to, not having a united country. And that's my biggest concern with any of the talk that was going on in that documentary is, this is more that would fracture the country into smaller parts than keep it united as a whole.
Well, what's wrong with that, though? I mean, we were never really meant to be a whole country. Federalism
Right.
is a real thing. We were supposed to be 50 sort of autonomous units.
But we were the United States of America. That is what we are. There's
Right,
still
but
country here. There's nothing wrong with being a nationalist in that respect.
the original overarching, like before the pre-constitution, was the Articles of Confederation. Now, Confederacy is when a lot of smaller states are part of a bigger one. Like the EU is a good example.
I was going to say, yeah, I thought we were supposed to be structured like the EU.
Right. That's how we're supposed to be structured.
But somebody's got to make the rules. And like you said, smaller states under a larger state. Well,
no, but the larger state isn't larger in that way, though.
But we've had 100 years of teaching our citizenry that they are equal. Right, they are equal. That everybody's equal. So that eventually that's going to tell somebody in California that they're just as equal as somebody in Minnesota. So all the rules need to be the same for everybody.
It's not that people aren't created equal, or that not all people are equal. It's that the definition of equal is manipulated.
That hasn't been clarified. That's the one thing that has not been done over the last 100 years, is to clarify those things. And so people see it as a very blanket, generic term that we're all equal. And the only place to get equality is for the overarching state to hand down the laws and rules and regulations that make us all equal. And I mean, the public's been taught to look to the state. That is going to be a hard nut to fucking crack. I don't care how much revolution you want to throw out there, how much boog talk you want to throw out there, how many protests or riots. You're not going to break that state very easily, because there's too many, as was said earlier, too many complacent people in this country that just want business as usual, and that means the state runs things.
Okay, I will talk to the issue of federalism, in that one problem I see is that you can look at the 1790 first census of the United States and then compare that to the current population, and what you see is one of the more moderately sized states has the population of all of those original states combined. And that what that tells me is that in some areas you even have 15 times the amount of people represented by a single person on the federal level as would have been in 1790. So what we see is that as the federal system grows, it's actually becomes less efficient and the representation becomes diluted. So there certainly needs to be a structural reform to ensure that that doesn't happen.
Well, a part of that does come from the fact that somewhere, I believe it was shortly after the Civil War, they capped the number of representatives that they could have in the House of Representatives, which is a problem in states like California. If we had gone by the original model, which I believe, and this is without me looking at the document, it was supposed to be one representative per 10,000 people. I mean, I will grant the fact that we would never get anything done in the House of Representatives with that much. But the other side of that is, I mean, that's kind of like my wet dream, is the federal government not getting anything done.
Yes, but the problem is that the federal government is actually supposed to get some things done, and we are trying to run a country here. So that would be a negative effect there.
Maybe you should ask yourself who our representatives are going to become. One of the biggest problems in Washington is lobbyist dollars, corporate lobbyists. Now,
no, the biggest problem in Washington is the people think that they're leaders now, they're not public servants.
Right.
Okay, I get that. But corporate lobbyists have a lot of power in Washington. And during these protests, as we've been seeing, corporations have a lot of power in the words that they say or don't say, right? They're moving voices, they're moving people. Watch corporate lobbyists become our representatives in Washington. Watch how many, as the corporatocracy begins to unfold, as it moves forward, this is going to happen. These will be the people that represent us in Washington over our politicians as they seek to
Well, it
usurp
does
the
kind of
place.
happen that way already, where when people retire from public office, a lot of times they'll become lobbyists
Paul Ryan.
afterwards. Yeah, that happened. That already
Touche.
happens.
So
Just
anyway,
the opposite direction.
to get back on topic, I'll just point out and say that I personally have thought about these issues quite a lot, and that's why I've designed my own political system on that end for anybody that's interested. But anyway, going back on topic, I'd like to put forward the question that Wyatt had brought forward to me before starting on the idea of you said social constructs, Wyatt.
Or social contract.
Yeah,
Social
they mentioned the social contract in the
social
video,
contract,
and then kind of
which
talked
is a
about
type of social construct.
yeah,
Right.
right. It's kind of the same thing. They just
Yeah.
came up with a new term, or at least popularized the term in the documentary.
Well,
But
actually, I don't want to interrupt you here too much, but it's actually a very long-standing term that's been used for a long time. Just to set the record straight.
which one, the social contract or social construct, or
Social
both?
contract. It has to do with social contract theory. They mentioned John Locke and people like that. So
Yeah.
it has a long history in political philosophy. Continue, please.
No, I was just gonna briefly mention, and my purpose of that question was more to kind of hear your guys' thoughts on it, because I was fairly new to the idea of that part in the documentary, but it was kind of talking about how um, everybody was kind of structured to believe something through the process of education and through these type of methods. And it kind of mentioned how democracy, although it seems like a good idea, they used an example of like, well, if you vote to hurt someone, is that really a good idea?
Mhm.
They kind of use that within their social contract. And like I said, I don't know too much about it as you do, Anavultus, and maybe the others here, but from what I took from that purpose of the example was that they were wanting it to be changed or at least updated to a more modern or newer approach instead of a approach what it is now. And that approach what it is now is democracy, and everybody who's American loves democracy
Mhm.
because they were taught it from a very young age. And I also took the example they used with George Washington, where they basically said, he never told a lie, but they replaced it with Walmart CEOs, and that the first
Mhm.
Walmart CEO never told a lie, kind of changing the viewpoint of it, and kind of saying that through education, it's the best way to keep people believing the same thing or having the same thoughts. And they thought that in the documentary that these thoughts need to change, and it needs to start from an early age.
Okay. Yeah, I think that education certainly has a big impact in how people think about politics. But I will also add that the particular position that the individuals interviewed in the part of a video referring to social contracts, the specific position that they had is what I would call a voluntarist position, where they believe that if someone does not consent to be governed by a government that uses the idea of consent of a governed, that is a social contract, as its legitimacy, that if someone does not consent to be governed, that person shouldn't be compelled to be governed
Right.
by force.
Mhm.
I think that was their position. So, Robert, what do you think about social contracts?
Well, now I don't know. Forgive me if this is a distorted view of it, but I see social contracts as more of a nice way of saying, you know, letting the state do its business. I mean, we enter into a social contract that we shouldn't kill one another, And so therefore, inherently, the social contract becomes law. It becomes enforceable. It becomes something to mete out justice. It's just a pretty package for wrapping up the same form of governing by calling it a social contract. And there is no way that someone, that you're going to be comfortable with somebody living outside of that social contract by not, you know, a, you know, dealing with them as if they're governed by that, because that gives them carte blanche to govern themselves and act the way they want to, but they still have to be met with justice in the event that they break a law from us, that's governed by social contracts. I mean, it that's what it seems to me, is it's just a prettier package for governing and controlling the citizenry.
Okay,
I
John.
like the way you put that, by the way.
Yeah. So, and Michael Vega said exactly what I was going to say. In much better terms, I think he put it. I ain't signed no contract. My mere coming to existence is not consent, and that's true. This social contract idea it's just another kind of like form of rhetoric in order to increase control. I mean, that's what it is. It's trying to control your behaviors and your obviously mostly just your behaviors, but your thoughts as well, and what you're allowed to do, what's acceptable in society. Um, but you being born again is not actually signing that contract, as people will suggest when they use that against you. They say, well, it's a social contract, so you have to. What most of the time it's in a conversation about taxes, but yeah, you know, it's like well, you that's what the price you pay for living in a society and these sorts of things. Well, you didn't choose that when you were born. You didn't choose to be born. It's something that happened to you. Like
Well,
one of
you
the
can
few
choose.
things that you
Yeah.
don't have to take personal responsibility for.
You can choose a different path when you're old enough.
Yeah, exactly. And so you're not allowed to. Another thing is with contracts is you can either sign them or not. You can't do that with a social contract. You are compelled and forced to sign it. In a metaphorically speaking. Um, and so therefore it's done by coercion, which means that any kind of contract like that is null and void. So no, social contract is a bullshit thing used just as rhetoric to get you to comply.
Okay, J. Edgar.
Well, and I'm going to carry exactly what John said, even further than that. I mean, just from Twitter battles that I've engaged in throughout the past few months, especially if I piggyback off of Freckle Liberty or something, because they love to throw that one at her. That social contract does seem to be the natural counter to taxation as theft, because,
Right.
well, you live in the society, it's a social contract.
More
And that,
roads.
my roads. But that definitely, and I hate to bring this back on to federalism, but that does seem to be the way that this is going with this. I've always understood that some people are going to want some more governance than other people, and that's the biggest problem is the equality idea that comes into putting laws and running a country back at the federal government, and that takes social contract into into the idea. That's the word I'm looking for. So when I look at this and when I talk about federalism and when I bring up the social contract, I always say that people vote with their feet. That's been something that I've talked about before. And when we go into a voluntary society, if we could possibly get into that, then we could consent and decide our own social construct based on where we live and the amount of governments that we want. If I want more government than what I currently have, I will move into an area that has more government, and I will either sign the social contract or just it'll be implied because I decided that I wanted to live in that place. Whereas if John wants to live with less government, then he'll move to a place that has no laws, no governance, and just basically someone there to sit there and represent him to the rest of the country and nothing else. And he will, in a sense, either sign the social contract or contract rather, that he's not going to beg for services, EMT,
Right.
police, anything else, and he's just going to take whatever comes to him because of it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Wyatt, now that we've discussed this, do you have any particular ideas about this?
Um, I would say not really particularly now. Like I do think that one of the points that John was making, and also Ed, and then Ron from the comments section and others, was basically saying that um, you having to sign a contract through written form is something that is valuable in society today because it puts your thoughts and your opinion fully on the signing of that document, but a social contract isn't necessarily something you sign or isn't something you necessarily agree to.
Well, it's
So,
for how
like I
people get
said,
a
that's
clear
not
shot at
really
your money.
something I knew before. What were you saying then?
I said it's how people get a clear shot at your money.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, and there's no way to opt out of it, and there's
Yep.
no way to negotiate either. Which with a lot of contracts you can negotiate. There's none of that with this social contract. It's just bullshit.
Okay. So my view on the idea of social contracts is, of course, I'm familiar with the ideas of various philosophers on this. For example, John Locke. But I tend to agree a little bit more with one of his predecessors. Um, it's my goodness, the name slipped my mind. Help me out here.
Don't you hate when that
Leviathan.
happens?
Leviathan. Who wrote that?
Oh fuck, Robert, you're the literary guy here.
Whoa, whoa, whoa. Doesn't mean I read anything. I mean, what is it? Jesus Christ! Don't put pressure on
You
me.
read for a living.
Why? Yeah, I'm not reading Leviathan though. I'm trying to.
Here, I'll look it up real quick.
Wait, it's
Hobbes. Thomas Hobbes, of course.
Thomas
Okay.
Hobbes.
I can't imagine why I forgot. But anyway, Thomas Hobbes had this idea that naturally people would, even if they weren't trying to hurt each other, their natural interests would be in conflict, and it is because of that that they would produce uh, bigger governments, and then afterwards, uh, besides the initial consent for creating the government, later on, that wouldn't be necessary because then the Leviathan takes over. But I think that it's actually, from an anthropological perspective, it's actually a much more natural process. I think what happens is you have the patriarchy, believe it or not, and matriarchies as well, where the most natural form of governance is the governance that parents and guardians have over young children, because children can't birth themselves, they can't wean themselves. So
Right.
obviously, you become in charge of a young child, and then that expands into a family structure, and then that expands into a tribe, and then based on that, you eventually start building kingdoms, chiefdoms, and eventually that develops into states as we see them.
Mhm.
So I actually don't think that our societies are based on contracts. I think our societies are based on imperialism of various forms, such as the natural imperialism of dominance over one's children,
Mhm.
or the imperialism of conquest, or the imperialism of being born in the jurisdiction of a country and therefore being that country's citizen. And I don't think that's a bad thing. I just think that that's the way things work. That's my opinion. What do you think?
Well, it really interesting the way that you put that, and where we look at the way our society and our nation is developing right now as we look. I mean, take healthcare for an example. It used to be that having health insurance was a perk for going to work for a certain employer, and the employers could arm wrestle with each other for having who's got better insurance and who doesn't have better insurance. But enough people were disaffected by this that they got together along with powerful people who were elected to represent these people in Washington, D.C., who decided, you know what, we don't like the fact that some people can work better than others. So we are going to, as you had mentioned, we're going to do a conquest. We're going to force the ideas of these people who are disaffected down the throats of everybody else, and therefore we're going to conquest. And we've been seeing it with representation for a while. Enough powerful people come together and they conquer, they get elected into a government and they conquer a minority or even a majority at this point. They break the will of them down, and then lo and behold, now we've got a federal law that affects everybody, whereas we used to be able to separate it by where we live and where we choose to live.
Okay.
Yeah, see, John hates it whenever I whenever I talk about or make this analogy with the government, but the parental analogy is so on point when it comes to our government and much the way the citizenry wants to be governed. As we look more to our parents to take care of things for us that we, you hear the vocal minority saying this should be a human right. Now, healthcare is a human right now, right? Much like you would expect if you were a kid at home, right? Your parents are supposed to take care of you, they're supposed to take you to the doctor, blah, blah, blah. Well, that's why the state gets so much stronger. When you have more kids in the household, you've got to lay down blanket rules for the house that everybody must abide by. And then certain ones can be tweaked along the way for age differences in the children. But, much the same way parenting should be taught at home. You teach your children the consequences of actions, because when you go out into the real world and you're controlled by the state, your actions are going to have consequences. So they both work hand in hand. And I see our government as having to need to take children under control, simply because of the fucking temper tantrums that they throw.
And that's the biggest problem, though, is that people do see the state as, and that's why the phrase nanny state exists, because that's what it is, right? People see that and nowadays as the state's job to like provide for its citizenry as opposed to just protect it and its rights. That's a huge problem. Instead of seeing them as servants, they're seen as leaders.
Yeah,
Instead
and
of working for us, we are working for them.
and
And
I
one of
think
the things that
It's a
weirds me
terrible
out about,
mentality to be in.
oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
I was just saying, one of the things that weirds me out about this idea that of having, the federal government come down and mandate everything to the states the way that they are, is I kind of look at, I've been kind of throwing this around in my head for a little while, but I kind of look at, going from one state to another as like going over to your friend's house. And I would have thought that, we would think more freedom minded about this. Like, this may be an outdated reference and Wyatt might not get it for his youth here, but, you're growing up here and in the 90s when smoking was still not bad for you or whatever. You're at home with strict parents and they don't want you to smoke when you're 14 years old. But you can go over to Johnny's house and Johnny's parents let him smoke, and now you want that rule in your house too. Yep. But somehow we're doing it in the authoritarian direction instead of the liberty direction.
Well, that's social media. Yeah. That's because of social media. Because the state, your individual state no longer matters when your voice is being blasted to the world as a whole. It doesn't matter that you're in California.
Yeah.
Your voice is what matters, and your voice is stateless unless it's directed to the overarching state.
Yeah. And I think it's also interesting how the state is, in a way, taking a lot of the authority that parents used to have over their children and then appropriating that for the state. So so we see this in a way through education, but this is also more apparent in how more laws are being put against corporal punishment of children.
Yes. Yes.
Where now, if you're a parent and you spank your child, even if it doesn't cause any injury, it is if people find out, it'll be heavily criticized. You'll have DCF come over to your home to do a check, and of course, on the anarchist side, you could say that one extreme in which the government has taken away power that parents used to have is if you look at many ancient cultures, including ancient Israel as a specific example, you see that if your children misbehaved, it used to be the parents' right to punish them up to and including the death penalty,
Yeah.
which is obviously not something that is legal in our society. But the question is, if the consent of the child does not matter when the child is young, for, let's say, a voluntarist position on raising the child, you don't need the child's consent to raise the child, then do you need the child's consent to punish the child harshly at that point as well? And then you end up the question on who gets to make these rules, who who would have any oversight on this. And of course, in an anarchist system, there wouldn't be anyone making the rules or having oversight on this.
Yeah. I think we hit on.
It's not necessarily that they wouldn't have anyone making rules in an anarchist society. That's a very common misconception. It's just that there's not a ruler.
Well, you can't
So it's
enforce
more,
rules without having some
Well-
sort of force.
right.
Well,
No, you
that's
would
not-
have something, but it wouldn't be like a ruler or like a ruling body. It would be
There will always be someone, though.
yeah. No, there would be someone who's highly influential. Yeah.
I was going to say, you
Well,
do want.
yeah, the division of labor requires that there be someone specific doing this.
You misunderstand the actual effectiveness of social pressure too. Like they'll
Right. It would still be
Well, I'm not saying people
still
would
come
do
down
this.
to-
I'm just saying that there's
Yeah.
cultures where this was a norm.
Mhm.
Well, see,
Yeah,
now,
yeah,
so
sure.
Ed makes a good point when he says social pressure, and I think corporal punishment in the home is an excellent example of where social pressure has changed the mindset of the population. And that is the fact that it's so much social pressure to get rid of corporal punishment at homes. It's wrong to spank your kids, blah, blah, blah.
Mhm.
We've gone through we're working on our third generation of people that are not dealing with corporal punishment in the home, which I'm a firm believer in, if done properly, not abusive, corporal punishment to punish for, action. But now it's being brought out to the state. Now they don't want punishment for actions as adults either. So
Right.
what do you want? What do? You reform police so that the punishments that are meted out are not as severe. You look for ways to, screw up the court systems and the penal system, because you don't want punishment. You don't want any kind of consequences for your actions because you weren't taught that there were consequences growing up. Because I'm sorry, a 5-minute timeout doesn't do shit for kids. I can tell you this from practical experience.
right.
I got to ask this here because I'm sure that John and I experienced it differently because of the age difference, and then Robert experienced it differently from us from the age difference. But Wyatt, if you're comfortable discussing it, how did punishment go in your home? Because you're the closest to it at this point. It wasn't that long ago for you when you were still in the upbringing stage.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think at first you would have to know a little bit about my parents because both of them are pretty conservative leaning. My mom was very much Baptist, like hardcore Baptist in her childhood. So, and her dad would do spankings and punishments like that. So, long story short, when I was growing up, I did have spankings, and I would say that my punishment was probably pretty relatable to what you would have experienced, Ed, and maybe what John experienced, based off of that, because my parents weren't really afraid to punish us through spankings or anything that's kind of similar to it, and I think that through my experience, kind of like what Robert briefly mentioned, I don't think it can be overdone because that can cause problems for the kid's psyche later on in life. But if done properly, and I don't even think it's that hard to do properly, but if done properly, it's a very good way to uh, get your kid or get myself as an example to obey authority and to pay attention, in this case, to your parents. And I know that like my teachers in high school, especially my older teachers, would talk about how they got punished mainly by philosopher type of teacher, and he was an older gentleman. But he was saying that even back then, because he went to Catholic school, that the nuns and things, and it's kind of a stereotype, but
Yeah.
they were able to punish their students in the actual school setting. And he thought that through his experience, that was actually something that helped him through his life and made him the person he sees himself today.
Yeah.
But just before we change topics, I thought I would kind of chime in on what y'all were discussing a little bit earlier. And I would just say that a lot of what y'all are talking about with the about parental control and other things, there's a lot of like in how government's kind of like the daddy figure. I know I've listened to a lot of conservative radio and tried to listen to some liberal stations as well, just to kind of balance it out. But a lot of like conservative radio stations always say that, the left is trying to make the government into a parent figure and try to make people rely on just the government. And the reason they do that and target the poor is because the poor are most, acceptable to fully trusting the government because of their lack of education or anything else you want to name for reasons. So I thought I would just kind of briefly mention that I hear that a lot of like conservative stations, and I do think that there's some truth to it, because I don't think the government should be valued as a parental figure by any means, and it's something that I think should not be trusted before it is trusted.
Okay. I'd like to say to a comment Michael Vega made in the comments, um, regarding how hitting only works on weak kids. I'd like to quote Sargon of Akkad and say it depends on the child.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I do have
It
an
does.
anecdote here. One of my relatives, um, there was a paddle on the wall, and the father would always look at the paddle whenever someone was doing trouble. And this one relative never made trouble and therefore never got spanked. One of my other relatives, uh, that was spanked all the time, but in his cost benefit analysis, it was worth it. So he would get in trouble, and he would do things, and he because he didn't care about getting spanked. So it really depends on the character of the child.
It does, yeah,
so-
because it kind of had the like a different effect on me. I mean, I was never hit much, but when it did, I was never like, oh, that sucked, I shouldn't do that again. It was more like, oh, that sucked, I shouldn't get caught doing that again.
Yeah.
So that was my kind of mentality at the time, and so it just kind of made me better at mischief
And
than it did stop me from being mischievous.
It does speak to the age too, and I mean, even when we go between the generations, I've seen my grandfather spank one of my cousins, and he was 16 because that was the way that things got done when he was younger and when he was raising kids. But
Hmm.
I mean, for me, yes, okay, 7, 8, 9, maybe even up to 10. If you do something wrong, you'll get the wooden spoon.
Hmm.
But I mean, by the time I was 11 and 12, my parents looked at it as more of, instead of the punishment, unless there was something really bad in which they had to take something away or something,
Hmm.
something that they paid for or whatnot, they saw it as more effective to discuss why what you did was wrong. Actually sit down and
Yeah.
so yeah, when you're young and you're first developing, yeah, that little spark of pain says, okay, well, I shouldn't do this again, like John was saying. But
Right.
at some point, you do have to start developing the mind, developing the philosophy of this. And I do
Yeah.
think I would carry that through with raising kids of my own. Unfortunately, I'm not doing that right now, but
Well, I think that what you were just talking about, that sudden, like, sharp pain, that's more of like an attention getter.
Mhm.
They're
Right.
throwing a tantrum or something, the quick little,
It's like
smack, and
training
now
a
you got their
dog.
attention.
yeah.
Yeah, now
Yes.
you got their attention. Then you can start discussing,
Mhm.
hey,
Well,
that's why this is wrong and whatever.
As a final note on this for me, I had I don't rarely use this term in regards to growing up, but I had the advantage of having both sides of the coin. I had one grandparent that was who punished with abuse, and another who punished with just punishment for action. It was it was repercussion for action, and it did teach me the difference between the two, to where I'm able to take away what I think good use of corporal punishment in a home with children should be. That might make people, can wake up and realize that, that's what the government's going to do to you. That's what the government's doing to you. And you're not going to get a positive result from telling them you can't punish me. You shouldn't be punishing me.
Okay. Let's shift topics here. Back to another topic coming from the video, the documentary. There was a statement made on international relations that the international system of law to the individual discussing it seemed to be a bit similar to anarchy in the way it works. What do you think, Robert?
International law, that one becomes a gray area for me because, there's nobody that's going to agree on it. Like if you can have international law, but let's get everybody in the world to agree on that international law. I mean, there's a very, very anarchist tone to it in how you deal with things and how people are addressed. When it's all said and done, I think international law is it's really foolish. It's foolish. I mean, the best that you should have is extradition options, and outside of that, I mean, there's no world court. There should not be a world court because, nobody will agree on it, and it doesn't suit every populace.
Yeah, certainly Hitler and the Nazis didn't agree for international arbitration. That wasn't voluntary. But John, what are your thoughts? International law and anarchy.
Well, that example that they gave in the documentary was kind of the point I was trying to make earlier about the anarchist society. Wouldn't doesn't mean that there are no laws, and that's kind of the example that they were giving. Doesn't mean that there aren't any laws. It just means that it's done by committee, by consensus, rather than by someone, making proclamations about what the law is. Or more than even just voting for it. If you go down to a small enough, if you go down to like a small enough society, you don't you can govern by consensus and not just by consent, but by consensus. I think that's kind of the point that they were trying to make when it comes to that example, and I do like that they did use international law as the example.
Yeah, so you do think that international law is somewhat representative of the idea of anarchy?
Somewhat, yeah, especially since there's very little they can do to enforce it. It kind of has to be voluntary enforcement.
A social contract, as it were.
Right, but one that you can sign. One that you can opt out of as well.
Okay. Wyatt?
I would say from what I took from the documentary is that I don't think you're ever going to get someone to fully agree with one law by itself. And I take that example of like the UN and the way the UN is structured through involving so many different countries. Them trying to agree on something has almost never been done. And I take a personal example with that in the mock UNs that I did back in high school, where you would be a smaller country and have to basically mock what the UN is supposed to do. And we never really agreed on something fully, even though our mission was to do that. But that's kind of besides the point a little bit too, and what the documentary was trying to say. But I don't think that just because you can't agree on like certain international laws that should be there in theory doesn't mean that you shouldn't have any at all. So I don't think that it's one or the other, and that's kind of what I took from that point.
Okay. J. Edgar?
No, international law is the perfect example of anarchy, and I do love the fact that they put this into the documentary because, I mean, it goes right along with what John had said. You can make it international law, absolutely, and the problem with, or not the problem with it, but the advantage of it is you are expecting the other person to comply, knowing full well that he can turn around and give you the finger and say, "The hell with you! I'm not going to follow your international law." So it does come down to the agreements on decency and expectation. either you are expected, or then you've got a bigger conflict out of this. So, yeah, I think that's perfect.
Okay. So I'll give you my perspective on this. Now, I am a bit familiar with the realist school on international relations, where one of the premises is that uh, the international system is anarchic. Okay, so I would agree that there is anarchy on the international level. However, I would disagree in saying that international law is a solidification of anarchy. I would say it's actually a bit the opposite, because what we see internationally is that what governs is not treating countries as equals. What governs is power dynamics. You have
Exactly.
the the strong powers, the people on the UN Security Council, the permanent members, the U.S. and it used to be the Soviet Union, now Russia, which is a bit weaker than the Soviet Union was at its peak. China is trying to rise up, but we'll see how that goes. But I see international law as a bit of a system that allows for the balancing of powers. It's established by the great powers in order to balance the powers and to also reinforce hegemony among the lesser powers. And that's where we see UN interventions happening, where it's the values of the few greater powers being forced onto other lesser powers that are then termed as rogue states, who can't just remove their consent from being subject to the law. And that's a big uh, thing that happened at Nuremberg after World War II. The idea that there are laws internationally that various countries don't actually have a choice into whether they should agree or not. And while I agree that the things that they were condemning at the Nuremberg trials were wrong things, I think it should have actually been condemned on the basis of the right of conquest, as in, we're here and we've won the war, so now we get to decide what happens to you based on our values, instead of trying to pull it back to the international law and then retroactively making them accountable to that. But maybe I'm getting a bit too sidetracked on that.
No, no, I think that you make an excellent point, because ultimately I see international law and any attempts to enforce international law, it's just an open door to let powerful countries attempt to become globalists. I mean, and it's really surprising to me the position, for instance, that Donald Trump has taken in, removing himself, or the desire to remove himself from these NGO organizations. And, because it's like, dude, the power is what gets you justice through international law. Being the most powerful country in the world gives you the weight of that power in those international decisions. Why would you want to walk away from anybody, any entity that you are the most powerful part of? I mean, it's just surprising to me that he doesn't look to that globalist approach, knowing who he is as a president, as a person, as a business person, etc. I don't know. Maybe that's just me, but yeah, I think it is just an open door for a power grab and for power manipulation.
Well, I mean, I look at the Trump presidency just from an outside view, and this is, not even from an educated view on this. I look at that and everything that he's done on the international stage, and the only thing that I can fathom in my mind when I look at that is he went in, looked at everything, and said, "Why the hell are we spending money on this?"
Because
Okay.
money is power. I mean,
Yeah.
that's
And
why
we don't have any money, at least.
But essentially, what I think this boils down to is that in the anarchic international system, what you end up seeing is actual. When you see actual anarchy in action, you see what has been said about the siege of Melos in ancient Greece, where the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
So it's this idea that there's no big policeman that is going to save you out there if you have a complete anarchy. What you have
Mhm.
is either the majority or whoever's strongest, whoever pulls together a force of significant amount in order to enforce their ideas, uh, can enforce it on other people who are not strong enough to defend.
Right. And this is something that it's a huge flaw in anarchist thinking, at least that I can see, because I've never gotten a good answer to that problem from anarchists, and I would very much like to, get a good answer for that, for the warlord problem, as you were basically describing.
Well, I got to ask a question for everybody here on this as well. Now, I know that we look at the world stage and international law as sort of anarchic, and in a way that it is, because who enforces it? Nobody enforces it. We just expect everybody to run in there. Does the presence of nuclear weapons on the world stage change the perception of the anarchic international law? Because knowing full well, if we do break some of these social contracts, as we say they are, we're going to end the world essentially, or we have the capability to. We're not necessarily going to, but we have the capability to.
Yeah.
Does that change anything in anybody else's mind?
Not really. I think
Yeah, not really.
everybody's, even though they have the access to it, is not going to use it because they're simply just too afraid to.
The mutually assured destruction. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, yes and no. I am a firm believer that when you have driven enough people into a corner together. So look, for instance, at North Korea, Russia, Iran. Turkey is falling under that umbrella as well. Even you could even consider Iraq, Afghanistan. When you push enough of these countries together, and then they collectively decide that they're going to do something, that becomes a different story when you start talking about mutually assured destruction, because big egos, etc. You know, I don't know. They may see more. See more power and more opportunity in a situation like what we're in this year, for instance, to do something and be more
What would be
aggressive.
the gain for it, though?
To make America look as foolish as they are saying that we do. I mean, just an attempt. It would be,
So
it's
there's
the effort, right? I mean, why would a country like North Korea threaten us with nukes when they full well know that right? I understand it's just a threat, or is it? Whenever you pull
I
enough
mean,
players in, I mean, how much do we need to piss China off before they decide that Russia and North Korea seem kind
China.
of friendlier
China.
than we do, right?
But think about the fact that, yes, North Korea has been threatening nuclear warfare against this country since Barack Obama has been in office, and they do claim that they have an intercontinental thermonuclear missile. Keep in mind the fact that they've never launched it. Because I'm
right.
as stupid as I think Kim Jong Un is,
I don't think he's stupid.
or as bloodthirsty as I think his luscious praying mantis of a sister is, they do know full well the fact that if they launch this
Right.
thing, there's not going to be a North Korea anymore.
See, the
Well,
thing
It
is,
will cease to exist.
for the most part with North Korea, it's about rattling their sabers and then being able to tell their own people, look, we threatened them and they didn't do anything. They're weak.
Yeah,
It's just another way of, gaining even further control and, pushing more propaganda
the only
onto their
ones
own people more than anything.
the only ones who really take the North Korean threat super seriously are the big media in the U.S.
Yeah.
Because from
Okay.
a realistic perspective, the North Koreans know that if they were to launch a nuke, it would mean the end of their country,
Right.
and therefore, unless they have some super ideologue in charge, which I don't think they do, they're not going to do something that is going to guarantee the end of their country.
Right.
Yeah.
And but when you take a situation like we have now, where we're busy focusing on ourselves, and we look, we could easily look weak out there to the world, but you have countries like Russia, China, Iran, Turkey, sitting around talking to each other, and they're actually having conversations right now that mock us. So, whenever you take a country like North Korea, the threats are one thing, but how realistic is a threat when if they feel like they have an ally behind their back? But I do think that it's possible that those negative elements on the world stage will look to international law as Trump pulls back from the world as a whole in the way he's doing. They may look to international law to call him to account in front of the world court. Now, it wouldn't surprise me to see that happening at some point in the near future.
Well, you'd also have to realize that the United States is a country that, because of its power that it has in the UN and the big funding, and because the US is the main enforcer of the UN, the US is also one of the few countries that can get away with withdrawing from UN arbitration without getting any sanctions of any kind, as
Right.
happened, I think, with a trial with the US and Nicaragua, where as soon as the trial was moving against the US simply removed themselves. And that really shows you who's got the most power in the UN, because there were no consequences for that.
Hmm.
Well, yeah, exactly. I mean, say
Because if
we
anyone
piss-
else does that, we'll put sanctions on them. But if the US does that, nothing happens.
Right.
well, yeah, I mean, say we piss off Italy one day, and Italy says, "Okay, we're going to sanction you." What's the U.S. going to say as a collective whole? Okay,
Oh no, no more fiats and no
Yeah.
more.
but I mean, on the other side too. I mean, Robert brought up twice, and it's an interesting aspect of the international law and what could happen there. I mean, the technology has changed, and that goes back to my idea of whether or not the existence of nuclear weapons has changed things. Because I mean, he keeps saying what North Korea, Turkey, and what was the other one, Iran, were the same
Iran,
things.
Russia.
Yeah, change those words around with Germany, Italy, and Japan, and what are we looking at 80 years later?
Yeah.
Yeah. So anyway, moving on to another point. I thought, in my opinion, that a lot of the points brought up in the documentary were centered very much on the American government and on the American experience. I know there were a couple of points that talked about the socialist dictatorships, but most of it was very American centric and very specific in that way. Do you think that that helps the point the documentary is making, or do you think that it really pigeonholes the status? What do you think, Robert?
I think it is. No, I think it's very indicative of America as a whole. I mean, it speaks to whatever you're preaching out there. Um, it's going to be very American centric for the most part. That's what everything is. Look at how we view the world as a whole. We look over at other countries, and you can hear it constantly on social media. This, and I consider it kind of uneducated. This diatribe. Oh well, look at them. Their speech is being trampled on. Their speech is being trampled on, or their gun rights are being infringed in this country. And I'm like, look, this is America. We've got a whole different setup than anybody else. You can't be American centric with these things. You really if you're going to try and expound it to a global level, you don't have a choice when it comes to how we're going to govern ourselves to be Americentric. You have to be, because there is, this experiment that we're still doing. I think we're still calling it an experiment. Um, it can't be compared to anything else. So anything that is going to come out as an ideology um, is going to be that way. And much like this documentary was, yeah, it was very American centric, but again, don't really have a choice.
Yeah, I'm just saying that on a philosophical perspective, I like to view things for a more theoretical, neutral lens. What
Yeah,
do you?
but
Yeah,
that wouldn't apply to the. That's what I take away from it with any of thing that comes out of this country is it cannot apply to other countries in the world. I understand about humans and human rights, but we can't expect that. We just there's no way, shape, or form that we can
yeah. I'm
expect
not
that.
I'm not saying that everything applies equally. What I am saying is that the criticisms of statism, if they're framed primarily in the case of the United States, therefore make those criticisms primarily only a criticism of American statism.
Well, I would agree with that, except to the extent that if you look at the evolution of where our statism can go, there are examples throughout the world of the different levels that it can reach. For instance, you could take a country like China and look at the statism there versus what it is here. But I could easily see us getting to that point one day in the future if we continue down the path we're going.
Can I take a crack at this here? Because I think I know what Robert's trying to say, and it's kind of the same point that I wanted to make on the same idea. What you have when he said the American experiment, that's a very apt way to put this, and that kind of brings the documentary back into frame here. You do have to keep in mind that for our country, from the moment that we gave George the finger, we were going into this sort of anarchic state that the documentary kind of wanted to see us in when they were talking about the monopoly of violence. We started out not quite there, but essentially there. And all the rest of the countries had to try and keep up because they saw how we were running with our freedom, especially post World War. They started to see how we were able to build and rebuild after they all got their entire countries destroyed. And okay, now we've got to sit here and try to catch up. Meanwhile, the United States, as we've grown more, and as you mentioned before, the patriarchy started to change things, and we started to have a state-run patriarchy. We've been trying to keep up and go back to sort of the monarchic view that the European countries, especially, but countries around the world started with. They've been trying to come our direction, and we've been trying to move theirs. So, yes, this absolutely is American centric because we are going. Well, the writers of the documentary are trying to push us back to where we were and even further than where we were.
Mhm.
Whereas in Europe, they're already moving in that direction, and they come from a root of monarchism. I don't know if any of that made any sense, but
Yeah.
it's how it rolled in my mind.
Well, I'd like to say that in the context, the historical context of the American Revolution, the way I view it is that it is, in a way, aristocratic because it is the state governments or the colonies at the time
Mhm.
that are primarily the main belligerents. So as opposed to a more grassroots movement, although it did reach grassroots support as
Right.
uh, as time went on. John, what do you think?
Um. So the original question was about it being Americentric, or
Yes.
that it was pigeonholing itself. Um. I mean, I kind of agree with that. I do think that obviously it was Americentric, but I think it kind of needed to be for their purposes. For one thing, they were, Americans. So naturally, they would have a vested interest in America moving towards their goal. But also, we are unique in a lot of ways, especially with how we think of individualism. Even a lot of the Western European countries, where we got our ideas from, like those philosophers. You mentioned John Locke and Thomas Paine is another good example. Um, but we kind of been that kind of culture since the start of our country. Since we actually gained independence and officially became the United States, we were very individualistic. So I think in a lot of ways we are more uh, likely to go in more anarchistic direction than most other places in the world. So I think it would be much easier to start here and show it as an example of it working to other places. So I can see why they would want to focus on America first when it comes to that.
Okay, but do you think that it would be a problem if, let's say, the U.S. goes full anarchy, but the rest of the world doesn't.
I think there would be a lot of problems. Obviously, one of them obviously being no central government to, you know, keep other countries from invading us. You know, a lot of the things that we hate do actually stop other countries. Mostly, you know, espionage will stop other countries from invading us. You know, keeping us informed on what our potential enemies are doing and all that. That does actually keep us safer as a country. Uh, I mean, obviously, I'm willing to give that up for
For liberty.
more for liberty, but I mean, it is an objective fact that it makes us safer as a country.
Mhm.
So where was I going with that? Shit. Yeah, that would obviously be a big problem with becoming a fully anarchist state while other countries aren't. Foreign invasion would be a big thing. Not agreeing on, I don't know, foreign trade would be an interesting one because it would be. I'm just kind of thinking out loud at this point. Um, you know, you might like China as a whole might trade with Southern California and whatever their deal is. Meanwhile, those aren't going to get over to like New York. You know, those products and stuff that are coming over.
Or
It would
some
be
of the agriculture that we're
areas.
currently
Maybe
trading
we'll
with
see a
them now.
return of big
Yeah.
opium.
Oh well,
Opium
yeah,
wars.
for sure. Yeah, that's true.
Because who's
People
gonna
start
stop
getting
it?
people would start getting Shanghaied again.
Yeah.
Okay, Wyatt, what do you think? Americentric.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah, I think that a documentary itself, from a filmmaking perspective, is you have to pick a certain like target demographic you want to have your documentary for, and I think that they were very much focused on their target audience being Americans and their viewpoints. And then I think from that point on, they wanted to focus on like Americans' pride of America. And I think that was clearly shown through them trying to show that, although democracy was a different idea, it's not necessarily the best idea. And here is our idea through the dot of anarchism. And I think that they wanted to make it clearly focus on America to for Americans because that was one, their target audience, and two, to keep it grounded just on uh, one idea. But I do think that they also showed perspectives from outside the country, like that one in New Mexico, or not New Mexico, what you mentioned earlier in the stream of their example of without police. And I'm kind of mixed feeling on that because yes, it's a good idea showing examples of their ideas working elsewhere, but at the same time, a lot of showing ideas working elsewhere doesn't really work for America because America is so different. So by showing a foreign country that's already doing it, like I take the example of healthcare, even though the documentary didn't really talk about it, healthcare is a common thing we hear a lot of in politics today of taking Canada or
We are the
Britain,
only civilized country.
yeah, as in their healthcare systems, and saying, hey, they're going to work in America when we're just entirely different in the way we work. So I don't think that their use of examples in that way made too much sense if they wanted to just have it focus on America.
Okay, so that's the main topics that we had exhausted. But I thought of an additional question. Is there any particular anarchist viewpoint that they mentioned? Any type of anarchism, any of a wide variety of flavors that's particularly stood out to you as either interesting looking or perhaps even appealing? Robert.
Oh, that's a tough one for me. I actually have to say, unfortunately, no. There really weren't too many perspectives that I could even fully start to agree with, because I kept looking at the end result, what I would expect would happen through many of those scenarios. Even talking about anarcho-capitalism, it's like, oh, that's a slippery slope to that corporatocracy that I'm talking. I worry about. So every one of those were just open doors to a more chaotic situation that was just run by a smaller, more chaotic state. So, there really weren't any that were that appealing to me, except, figuring out some way to fix taxes. I mean, if there was,
Hey, that's half the battle right there.
Right,
becoming a libertarian.
If you could fix taxes through some anarchist way, maybe. But outside of that, no. It again leads me to the inevitability of the state.
Okay, and I wasn't really trying to ask if you particularly liked a system, but maybe something was fascinating. Is there?
Well, there was the and what was it? The panarchy.
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 This idea, that was the idea of each individual little community choosing their own form of governing.
No,
right?
Actually, that was polycentrism. Panarchy is where each individual chooses to be part of a community, irrespective of geographic location. Yeah. So there's no jurisdiction, which is
right. So both of those,
both of
those, I did find interesting from the standpoint of Schadenfreude. I would want to see it somewhere actually happening, just to see what kind of chaos it creates, or how, if it would actually work. But I would be terrified to see it trying to happen here in America. But yeah, so that would interest me, just to see if something like that is even possible. Either one of those aspects of it, because I thought they were both ludicrous and crazy. I'm just like, how could you even make that work?
Yeah. John?
I'm going to go with volunteerism. Is probably the most appealing, mostly because I'm pretty much there for the most part. I'm having a hard time getting rid of that shackle of let's just have a little bit of government, But besides that, I'm pretty much already there. So that's what I would say appeals most to me. It's just that ability to have the choice of opting in or opting out of the social contract that we all hear about.
Yeah. Wyatt?
I would say I can't remember in a documentary exactly what it's called. I think it was what Robert was mentioning, if it was towards the end of the documentary. But it was essentially mentioned very briefly about what if the two sides were to be split and you would have your own rules and legislation and ways of life on one side and then the other on the other side. Because the documentary talked about how basically the country split half and half. Yes, you have some libertarians in there, but they're not that much to where can even really care about them. But you kind of have your two main viewpoints, so you would just kind of split them down the middle and see from there. And that idea does interest me, because I do think that we're so divided that there's a very small chance it could work, but I don't necessarily see it as a idea that could work.
Okay. J. Edgar?
Well, I've always called myself a federalist because I do believe that all the people are going to decide for themselves, even if you take the shackles of the system off of them. They're going to decide for themselves how much government they want and work towards doing that. And that kind of leads me down where John was too, on the voluntarist side. But voluntarism does go a bit further than where I go, in which people do have the opt-out option for that. And I really like that, just to have the idea of, okay, well, do I really want to have this service or not? So yeah, I like the idea. I really do. It seems to align with where I already am. So
okay. I'll give my own take. I, of course, already have my own political ideology with which I have personally developed, so I wasn't really swayed by anything that I saw. But one thing that I found was interesting was when they mentioned the digger movement and Christian anarchism. They dwelled on that moment for a bit when they were discussing the history. And I'd just like to point out to any of my, as a man of God, to any of my brothers out there, that is heresy, lads. Stay away from that. Okay. Okay. Now we've exhausted the main topics. If anybody in the chat would like to ask some questions, go ahead real quick. In the meantime, any of you, anything you'd like to say?
I'm actually quite offended because Michael Vega called me a fucking statist, and I'm very triggered right now. So
Hey, me too.
he did. He called you one too.
You know what?
I mean, he's not wrong.
John, I have to say, I do believe that you carry a certain amount of statist in you. No matter how much libertarian you might preach and stroke your beard, there's a level of statist in you that understands that
but the
state
problem
is necessary.
The problem is it's literally inside me, and it's not using any lube, and I don't appreciate that.
No, I honestly, I have to say that I believe that what's going on right now in this country is an excellent, I don't know, a snapshot of what we could expect were we to try and go into something like a more anarchist situation. I mean, that's kind of where we're at right now. I mean, we've got people that are making their own rules and doing their own thing, and everybody is picking their own agenda to go from. And with so many people in this country, that's exactly what would happen. It will become about personal agendas and who you deal with and what you do. You're going to have to eventually have a state to control the anarchy.
Well, did you, Robert? Did you catch the story that I read this morning over on a Contemporary, over by the Wendy's in Atlanta, where they've got guys out with long guns saying that police are not allowed in this area anymore?
Oh no, I didn't see that.
Yeah, that was incredible. Which, I mean, to me, that makes my little libertarian heart beat a little bit faster here, because hey, your first line of defense is yourself. But
is that Chop Jr.?
Yeah.
But I mean, if you look at it, I mean, look at where we're at right now. All of this over what's not really the problem. These are not, the whole Black Lives Matter movement, all of these things, the police brutality. These are not the actual problems. These are not what's really wrong. What's really wrong is the corruption. And you're not going to fix the corruption by asking for more corruption to stop the chaos that's going on.
But hey, my corruption is the good corruption. Don't worry about my corruption.
Right.
I think Capone said that.
I'm doing corruption for you, not against you.
No matter which faction you're in this country, if your agenda is authoritarian, there's an authoritarian element to every one of these agendas that relies on thought control, that relies on pressure and some form of oppression, some form of inequality, some form of something. Mm-hmm. So why are we bucking this? The inevitable is going to happen. Why not take it from the devil we know already? Just try and fix the parts that we can.
Robert, your allegation that my agenda has some sort of authoritarianism and oppression is oppressing me.
Yeah,
I understand that.
We can now inflict violence on you, and it'd be justified.
Your own ideology oppresses yourself.
Oppress me, Daddy.
That's right.
See, I have a lot fewer years left on this in this whole thing than you guys do. So I'm just like,
assume.
Take what you get, but it's I know what's coming. I know what's coming.
That I drink pretty heavily.
Yeah, exactly.
Right, the writing's been on the wall for for the last 100 years. Specific things happen and have happened that have created this manifest destiny of an authoritarian state that is going to eventually kick in, and it's either going to be our government or it's going to be corporations.
Well,
Enough said.
having mentioned that, I think it's interesting to note that if we're making historical parallels, that before Caesar came to power in Rome, there was actually a situation of widespread street violence with opposing political groups uh, getting together in gangs and attacking each other on the streets. And if we're starting to see that here, if we're drawing a parallel, it could be a prelude to an eventual tyranny.
Yeah.
I was just about to say, and look at that, a dictatorship rose out of it.
Well,
Just like
Exactly
that,
the
for no
opposite of
reason
what
at
the
all.
anarchists are hoping for.
Yeah.
Well, that's going on the mild assumption that we're not already under a tyranny with other tyrants wanting to put their own brand of tyranny into play.
Well, I mean, it's like with gender, right? There's a spectrum of tyranny.
Right. So here that talking about Caesar, that I'll do a parallel with parenting. I had a altercation with one of my children when she was young, and she got out of hand, and I disciplined her with a spanking, and then sat down and talked to her after and told her why I did it, and we discussed it, and she thanked me for the discipline. And that's exactly what people in this country will eventually do when the boot comes down.
Yeah.
They will thank the government for bringing peace and order to the country and putting us back on a track where we could just focus on our lives. That is how the sheeple will respond to something like that.
Yeah, I mean, it is actually really amazing how many people haven't moved on from kind of the well, I was going to go into adolescent egocentrism, but what it really is they just haven't moved on to like a more mature mentality, even if they are, successful in a job or mature in a certain way. They're still childlike in that mentality of needing someone above them to tell them what to do and what they can and can't do, and that structure that children craves.
Sure.
Not everyone grows out of that, and that's a big problem, I think.
Well,
Okay.
and exactly.
Okay, so with that, I'd like to give everybody a chance to give some closing remarks because I'm gonna be wrapping this up. I don't live alone. I've got a family, so I don't want to disturb their precious sleep.
Sure,
So,
of course.
Yeah, so let's start wrapping this up.
Right.
Robert?
Well, I think my thoughts on this have been stated pretty clearly. I appreciate you having me on so that I could add my 2 cents to this. But, I understand that there's where the documentary Monopoly on Violence was coming from. I understand what it was presenting. But I also understand that, as I said, the inevitability of the state is bigger than any of our hopes and dreams might be.
Okay. John?
Yeah, firstly, thanks for doing this, Anavultus. It was a really cool conversation. Thank you guys, obviously, for being here, everyone in the chat, and these other unimportant faces here. And also just kind of a, little bit of message of hope, I guess. You don't need someone to tell you what to do. You don't need the government to tell you what to do. You don't need, anyone else. You are an adult. You can make your own decisions for knowing what's best for you. Someone else can't do that for you. It's something you have to do for yourself. And remove the shackle of statism, I suppose.
Okay. Wyatt?
I'd also like to thank you, Anavultus, for having me on. It was a very good experience, and thank you everyone else for being here as well. But I would say the perspective I most took away from the documentary, and I think I'm the most newest to libertarianism or politics in general compared to everyone else here, but I didn't necessarily think about a lot of the thoughts that the documentary proposed. So I think I still have a lot more thinking to do from the documentary. But I would say the biggest takeaway I had from it were two things. One, that although it seems like a very hard thing to do, and to not go along with the government, it's not as hard as it seems, and you could do it through the ways they kind of showed at the end of the documentary. And then the second big takeaway I had was kind of the perspective when you asked the question of alternative ideas that they proposed, and that was of the two ideas where you would kind of split the country. And I was just kind of thinking of that idea more. And I think that's kind of the biggest, if I had to choose like one takeaway of it, was probably that, of that idea, as I didn't really think of that before. But at the same time, it kind of did think about it just in other ways.
Okay. J. Edgar?
I think the biggest takeaway that I had from this, I mean, it was all great ideas that they had in this, but the fact of the matter is before you can go to implement anything like this and hope to God it stays like this, you have a lot of state mandated and state centric education that you have to undo.
Mhm.
And I don't think that's a very light task at all.
It's not.
Yeah. Okay. And my closing remarks, speaking of state-centered education, it reminds me a bit of Plato's Republic, where the new society is established by not only educating all the young people, but also by eliminating all of the older people that prefer the previous system, as is written in Plato's Republic. But anyway, thank you all for watching. Thank you all for joining me. I thought that this was a great discussion. Certainly lived up to my expectations. And if you're ever interested in any other discussion, I'd be happy to have you. And of course, all the people that joined in the chat and later viewers as well, feel free to ask questions. I'm sure that we're always willing to have an open conversation on these issues. And it is because we are able to have this conversation that it allows us all to grow in our understanding of these issues. So thank you all for watching, and I'm sure we will all be seeing you next time at whatever location or whatever venue we are represented. So that's it. Everybody say goodbye.
Thanks, Anavultus.
Adios.
Good night.
See you guys.
Thank you. Take care.
Okay. Goodbye. Anavultus over and out.